The sea roared like a beast, its waves clawing at the pier as if trying to drag it into the abyss. An old woman stood at the edge, her frail frame swaying against the wind, her silver hair whipping across her weathered face. She clutched a tattered shawl, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the sky bled crimson into the churning water. Eleanor had come to this pier every evening for 60 years, her steps slower now, her hands trembling with the weight of time. The townsfolk of Haven's End called her the Widow of the Waves, a name whispered with both reverence and pity. She was a fixture here, as constant as the tides, her presence so familiar that the fishermen no longer noticed her except for one. Jacob, a young fisherman with calloused hands and a heart still soft enough to ache, watched her from his boat. He was new to Haven's End, drawn by the promise of a simple life hauling nets under the open sky. But Eleanor's quiet vigil unsettled him. She never spoke, never begged, never asked for anything until tonight. "May I hold your net, just once more?" Her voice cracked like driftwood, barely audible over the wind. Jacob froze, his hands tightening on the coarse rope. Her eyes, pale as sea glass, held a desperation he couldn't name. "Why?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. No one touched a fisherman's net. It was bad luck, an unspoken rule as old as the sea itself. Eleanor's lips trembled, but she didn't answer. Instead, she reached out, her gnarled fingers hovering over the net piled at his feet. Jacob's instincts screamed to pull it away, but something in her gaze, grief, or memory, or both, stilled him. He nodded, stepping back, and watched as she took the net in her hands. Her fingers moved with a startling grace, weaving through the ropes as if they were threads of her own life. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, Jacob swore the wind softened, the waves hushed. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. She handed the net back, her hands shaking, and turned to shuffle away. Jacob called after her, "Why once more?" But she didn't turn back, her figure disappearing into the fog rolling off the sea. He stood there, the net heavy in his arms, feeling as if he'd glimpsed something sacred and lost. The next evening, Eleanor was back, standing at the same spot on the pier, her shawl flapping like a tattered sail. Jacob watched her from his boat, unable to shake the memory of her hands on his net. He'd asked around town about her, but the answers were vague old stories of a husband lost at sea, a life spent waiting. No one knew why she came to the pier, why she stared at the water as if it owed her something. He tied his boat and approached her, his boots thudding against the warped boards. "Eleanor," he said, testing her name. She flinched, surprised, but didn't turn. "Why do you want to hold my net?" She was silent so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, softly, she said, "It's all I have left of him." "Him?" Jacob pressed, his curiosity outweighing his caution. "My Thomas." Her voice was a whisper, carried away by the wind. "He was a fisherman, like you. The sea took him, but not before it gave us this pier, this net, this life." Jacob's chest tightened. He'd heard stories of men lost to the ocean, but Eleanor's words carried a weight that made his own life feel small. "What happened to him?" he asked. She turned to him then, her eyes glistening. "The storm of 63. He went out, said he'd be back by dawn. I waited here, holding his net, believing it would bring him home." She paused, her gaze drifting to the horizon. It didn't. Jacob didn't know what to say. He'd faced storms himself, felt the sea's wrath, but he'd always come back. "I'm sorry," he managed, the words feeling inadequate. Eleanor shook her head. "Don't be. The sea gives, and the sea takes. But it leaves memories." She reached out, her hand hovering near his net again. "May I?" This time, Jacob didn't hesitate. He handed her the net, watching as her fingers traced the knots with a tenderness that made his throat ache. She hummed a soft tune, one he didn't recognize, and for a moment, the pier felt like a church, the sea its choir. Over the next week, Jacob found himself looking for Eleanor each evening. She was always there, waiting, her eyes on the water. He began to leave his net on the pier for her, watching from a distance as she held it, her hands moving as if they remembered something her mind had half forgotten. He didn't understand why it mattered to her, but he felt bound to her in a way he couldn't explain. One night, as the moon hung low over the water, a stranger appeared on the pier. A woman, middle-aged, with sharp eyes and a scarf tied tightly around her head. She approached Eleanor, her steps hesitant, and Jacob, watching from his boat, felt a prickle of unease. "Mother," the woman said, her voice sharp with an old wound. Eleanor froze, the net slipping from her hands. "Clara," she whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. Jacob's heart stuttered. No one in town had mentioned Eleanor having a daughter. The air grew thick with tension as Clara stepped closer, her face a mix of anger and sorrow. "You're still here," she said, her voice breaking. "All these years, and you're still waiting for him." Eleanor's hands clutched her shawl, her eyes wide. "I have to," she said. "He's out there." "He's gone, Mother." Clara's shout cut through the wind. "He's been gone for 40 years. I lost him too, but I didn't lose myself to this Pier." Jacob wanted to look away, to give them privacy, but he couldn't move. Clara's words hung heavy, and Eleanor's silence was heavier still. Finally, Eleanor spoke, her voice barely audible. "You left, Clara. You left me here." Clara's face crumpled, and she turned away, her shoulders shaking. Jacob watched, his heart pounding, as she walked off the pier, leaving Eleanor alone with the net at her feet. The pier creaked under the weight of the silence Clara left behind. Eleanor stood motionless, her hands still gripping the edges of her shawl, as if it could anchor her against the storm of her daughter's words. Jacob, watching from his boat, felt the weight of their exchange settle into his bones, a grief he had no right to claim but couldn't shake. He didn't approach her that night. Something told him she needed the sea more than she needed words. But the next evening, when he returned to the pier, Eleanor was there again, her silhouette small against the vast, darkening sky. The net lay untouched at her feet, and for the first time, Jacob saw hesitation in her posture, as if the ropes had lost their magic. He stepped onto the pier, his boots soft against the wood. "Eleanor," he said gently, "you all right?" She didn't answer at first, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Then, slowly, she turned to him, her face etched with lines that seemed deeper than the day before. "She thinks I'm a fool," she said, her voice raw. "Clara, she thinks I've wasted my life waiting." Jacob shifted, unsure how to respond. He'd seen the pain in Clara's eyes, the kind that came from loving someone who seemed to love a ghost more. But he saw Eleanor's pain too, the kind that clung to hope like a life raft. "She's hurting," he said finally. "Doesn't mean she's right." Eleanor's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "You're kind, Jacob. Kinder than most." She bent slowly, her hands trembling as she reached for the net. But this time, her fingers didn't dance over the ropes. They hovered, uncertain, and she let them fall back to her sides. Jacob crouched beside her, picking up the net himself. "Tell me about Thomas," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Not the storm. Before that. What was he like?" For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then her eyes softened, and she began to speak. "He was stubborn," she said, a faint laugh escaping her. "Always had to fix things himself, nets, boats, even our old radio. He'd sing while he worked, off-key, but it made me laugh." Her voice grew warmer, as if the memory were a fire she could still feel. "He'd bring me shells from the shore, little ones, perfect ones. Said they were treasures from the sea." Jacob listened, the net heavy in his hands. He could see Thomas in her words, a man who loved deeply, who lived for the sea and the woman who waited for him. "Sounds like he was a good man," he said. "He was," Eleanor whispered. "But he loved the sea too much. More than me, sometimes." The confession hung between them, raw and heavy. Jacob wanted to argue, to tell her that couldn't be true, but the look in her eyes stopped him. It wasn't anger or bitterness, it was acceptance, worn smooth by decades of waiting. Over the next few days, Jacob made a habit of talking to Eleanor. He'd share stories of his childhood in a landlocked town, his first time on a boat, the way the sea had called to him until he couldn't ignore it. In return, she told him more about Thomas, how they'd danced on this very pier under a harvest moon, how he'd promised her a house by the sea, how he'd kissed her forehead before every trip, saying, "Back by dawn, my love." But she never mentioned Clara again, and Jacob didn't ask. The wound was too fresh, too deep. Instead, he focused on the net, leaving it for her each evening, watching as she held it with a reverence that made his heart ache. He began to wonder if the net was more than a memory, if it was a tether to a life she couldn't let go. One evening, as the sky burned orange and the waves whispered secrets, a new figure appeared on the pier. A boy, no older than 10, with wild hair and a fishing pole slung over his shoulder. He marched up to Eleanor, bold as brass, and said, "Are you the lady who waits for the sea?" Eleanor blinked, startled, and Jacob, standing nearby, stifled a laugh. The boy's name was Sam, a local kid known for sneaking onto boats and asking too many questions. "Who told you that?" Eleanor asked, her voice cautious. "Everybody," Sam said, shrugging. "They say you're waiting for a ghost." "That true?" Jacob tensed, ready to intervene, but Eleanor's face softened. "Not a ghost," she said. "A memory." Sam tilted his head, studying her. "My grandpa says memories are like fish. You gotta let him go sometimes, or they stink up the place." Eleanor laughed, a sound so rare it caught Jacob off guard. "Your grandpa's a wise man," she said. "But some fish are worth keeping." Sam grinned, then held out his fishing pole. "Want to try? Bet you're good at it." To Jacob's surprise, Eleanor took the pole. Her hands were unsteady, but Sam guided her, showing her how to cast the line into the water. For the first time in days, Jacob saw a spark in her eyes, a flicker of life that wasn't tied to the net or the past. That night, as Sam ran off with a wave and a promise to return, Eleanor turned to Jacob. "He's a good boy," she said. "Reminds me of Clara when she was young." Jacob nodded, sensing the weight of her words. "You miss her," he said, not a question. "Every day," Eleanor admitted. "But she's right. I've been waiting too long." Jacob didn't know what to say. He wanted to tell her to keep waiting, to hold on to whatever kept her going. But he saw the exhaustion in her eyes. The sea had taken so much from her Thomas, Clara, years of her life. Maybe it was time for her to take something back. The sea was restless, its waves crashing against the pier with a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. Eleanor stood at her usual spot, but tonight, she wasn't alone. Sam, the boy with the fishing pole, had become a regular visitor, his chatter filling the silence that had once belonged to the wind and waves. Jacob watched them from his boat, a smile tugging at his lips as Sam taught Eleanor how to bait a hook. Her hands, so steady with the net, fumbled with the slippery worm, and Sam's laughter echoed across the pier. It was a sound Jacob hadn't realized he'd been missing, a sound that made the pier feel alive again. "Got one," Sam shouted, his pole bending as a fish tugged at the line. Eleanor clapped, her face lit with a joy Jacob hadn't seen before. He tied his boat and joined them, crouching beside Sam as the boy reeled in a small, silver fish. It flopped on the pier, gleaming in the moonlight, and Sam whooped in triumph. "You're a natural," Jacob said to Eleanor, half teasing. She waved him off, but her smile lingered. "Sam's a good teacher," she said, her voice softer than usual. "He reminds me of what it's like to live for today, not yesterday." Jacob nodded, his chest tight. He'd grown used to Eleanor's stories of Thomas, her quiet rituals with the net, but seeing her with Sam was different. It was as if the boy had cracked open a window in her heart, letting in a sliver of light. Over the next few evenings, Sam became a fixture on the pier. He'd bring his pole, his endless questions, and sometimes a piece of candy he'd swiped from the general store. Eleanor took to him like a grandmother, her stern edges softening as she listened to his tales of school, his dog, and his dreams of sailing the world. Jacob watched, amazed at how easily Sam had slipped into her life, filling a space he hadn't realized was empty. But not everyone was pleased. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Clara returned. She stood at the end of the pier, her arms crossed, watching Sam and Eleanor with a frown that cut deeper than the sea. Jacob, sensing trouble, approached her. "She's happy," he said, keeping his voice low. "Sam's good for her." Clara's eyes flashed. "She's replacing me," she said, her voice tight. "First my father, now me. She's building a new family with that boy and her precious net." Jacob shook his head. "It's not like that. Sam's just he's giving her something to hold on to besides the past." Clara's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. She watched as Sam handed Eleanor a shell he'd found on the beach, her mother's face lighting up as she turned it over in her hands. For a moment, Clara's expression softened, but then she turned and walked away, her footsteps sharp against the pier. Jacob didn't tell Eleanor about Clara's visit. He didn't want to dim the light in her eyes. But he couldn't shake the feeling that Clara's pain was a storm waiting to break, one that might sweep Eleanor away if she wasn't ready. The next evening, Sam didn't show up. Eleanor stood alone, her hands empty, the net untouched at her feet. Jacob watched her from his boat, his heart sinking. "Where's the kid?" he asked, climbing onto the pier. Eleanor shrugged, but her eyes were distant. "Kids get bored," she said. "He'll be back." But Sam didn't come back the next night, or the night after that. Jacob asked around town and learned that Sam's mother had grounded him for sneaking onto a neighbor's boat. It was a small thing, but it left Eleanor quieter, her hands lingering longer over the net as if it were all she had left. One evening, as the sky turned purple and the sea grew still, Jacob decided to act. He brought his own fishing pole to the pier, a spare he kept on his boat. "Here," he said, handing it to Eleanor. "Sam's not the only one who can teach you." Eleanor looked at the pole, then at him, her eyes wary. "I'm too old for this," she said. "Nonsense," Jacob said, grinning. "You've got steadier hands than half the fishermen I know." She hesitated, then took the pole. Jacob guided her, showing her how to cast, how to feel the tug of the line. Her first cast was clumsy, the line tangling in the wind, but she laughed a real, full laugh that made Jacob's heart lift. They spent the evening fishing, the net forgotten for once, the sea a partner instead of a thief. As the weeks passed, Eleanor began to fish more, her hands growing steadier, her smile more frequent. Jacob noticed other changes too. She started wearing a brighter shawl, one with threads of blue that matched the sea. She spoke less of Thomas, though his name still slipped into her stories, soft and warm like a well-worn blanket. But Clara's absence lingered, a shadow Jacob couldn't ignore. He knew Eleanor felt it too, though she never said so. He wanted to fix it, to bring mother and daughter back together, but he didn't know how. All he could do was stay, keep fishing with her, keep listening. One night, as they sat on the pier with their lines in the water, Eleanor turned to him. "You're a good man, Jacob," she said. "Thomas would have liked you." Jacob smiled, his throat tight. "I hope so," he said. "But I'm here for you, not him." Eleanor's eyes glistened, and she reached for his hand, squeezing it briefly. "Thank you," she whispered. The pier was bathed in the soft gold of dawn, a rare morning when Eleanor arrived before the sun. Jacob was already there, mending his net, his fingers deft as they wove through the ropes. He looked up as her footsteps approached, surprised to see her so early, her face lit with a quiet determination he hadn't seen before. "I want to go out," she said, her voice steady. "On your boat. Just once." Jacob's hands stilled. The sea was calm today, but Eleanor was frail, her steps unsteady on solid ground, let alone a rocking boat. "It's not safe," he said gently. "The water's tricky, even on a good day." Her eyes met his, unyielding. "I've waited 60 years on this pier, Jacob. I've held his net, felt his life in my hands. But I've never gone out there, where he was." She paused, her voice softening. "Please, just once more, before I can't." Jacob's heart clenched. He wanted to say no, to keep her safe on the pier, but the look in her eyes told him this wasn't just a whim. It was a reckoning. He nodded, helping her into the boat, her hands gripping his arm with surprising strength. The sea was gentle as they glided out, the horizon stretching wide and endless. Eleanor sat at the bow, her shawl wrapped tightly around her, her eyes drinking in the water. Jacob watched her, his hands steady on the oars, feeling the weight of her trust. For the first time, he understood why she'd stayed on the pier all those years, not just for Thomas, but for the sea itself, the place where her heart still lived. They didn't speak for a while, the only sounds the creak of the boat and the soft lap of waves. Then Eleanor reached for the net, which Jacob had brought at her request. She held it, her fingers tracing the knots, and began to hum a tune Jacob recognized from the pier, soft and haunting. "Throw it," she said suddenly, her voice firm. "Let it go into the sea." Jacob hesitated. The net was his livelihood, hours of work woven into every knot. But her eyes were fierce, and he knew this was what she'd come for. He cast the net, watching it spread across the water like a prayer, sinking into the depths. Eleanor watched it disappear, her face calm, but her eyes wet. "That's for him," she said. "For Thomas. He's free now." Jacob's throat tightened. He didn't fully understand, but he felt the weight of her words, the release in them. They sat in silence as the boat rocked gently, the sea cradling them like a mother. When they returned to the pier, something had changed. Eleanor's steps were lighter, her shoulders straighter. She didn't look at the horizon with the same hunger, and for the first time, Jacob wondered if she might stop coming to the pier. The next evening, he was proven wrong. Eleanor was there, but she wasn't alone. Clara stood beside her, her face softer than Jacob had ever seen it. Sam was there too, his fishing pole slung over his shoulder, a grin splitting his face. Jacob's heart lifted at the sight, though he stayed back, giving them space. "I'm sorry," Clara said, her voice low but clear. "I didn't understand. I thought you were choosing him over me." Eleanor reached for her daughter's hand, her fingers trembling. "Never," she said. "I was holding on to him, so I wouldn't lose you too." Clara's eyes filled with tears, and she pulled her mother into a hug, the kind that had been waiting decades to happen. Sam, oblivious to the weight of the moment, tugged at Eleanor's shawl. "Come on, let's fish," he said, and Eleanor laughed, the sound carrying over the pier. Jacob watched them, his chest full. He didn't know if Eleanor would keep coming to the pier, if she'd hold another net or cast another line. But he knew she'd found something new to hold on to Clara, Sam, maybe even him. The sea had taken so much, but it had given her this moment, this family, this chance to live again. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of fire and gold, Eleanor turned to Jacob. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. "For the net, for the boat, for listening." Jacob smiled, his heart full. "Anytime, Eleanor." She looked out at the sea, her eyes bright. "I think I'm ready," she said, almost to herself. To let him go,